a regional power grid serving 3 states. 22 minutes before noon, load peak. Then, a single dad lineman in stained coveralls walked onto the substation floor, his 5-year-old daughter's yellow hard hat keychain clipped to his belt. The CEO laughed in front of the press. "Stick to changing fuses, sweetheart." 22 minutes later, every light from Amarillo to Shreveport went dark. Margaux Tessen had inherited Tessen Power and Light 11 months ago after her father's stroke. She arrived at substation number 4 at 5:48 with 2 state regulators and 3 journalists beside her, expecting a clean tour. Then she saw him at the fuse holder under bus 4. His gloved hand on the disconnect, his eyes on the SCADA panel reading drift in the upper corner. The yellow hard hat keychain swung quietly at his belt. She crossed the gravel pad in 17 strides. She did not call out. She did not signal. She simply arrived. In front of 2 regulators, 3 journalists, and her own field supervisor, she ended his employment. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not pull the patent number from his back pocket. He clipped his tools, picked up his lunch pail, and walked out through the perimeter gate. What no one on that gravel pad knew was that the man she had just fired was the only living engineer who could bring the Eastern grid back online. Stay with this one. It earns it. To understand what happened in those 22 minutes, you have to go back to a Tuesday in May on the West Texas outskirts, where the sky goes pale before the sun does. Tessen Power and Light Substation number 4 sat on a 40-acre gravel pad 7 miles outside the town of Briar Wells. The transformers there carried half a gigawatt at full load. The fence was chain link, 10 feet, topped with razor wire that had been replaced after a coyote got into the yard in March. There was no music, there was no traffic, there was only the hum. A substation hums at 60 cycles per second. If you stand close to a transformer long enough, your back teeth will hum with it. The men who work substations learn to stop hearing it the way a sailor stops hearing waves. But Roman Vaer never stopped hearing it. He listened to the hum the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. And on that particular Tuesday morning, the hum at bus 4 was a quarter cycle off. He had noticed it the day before. He had logged it in the maintenance ticket. He had also written, in his neat block letters in the margin, the words, "Directional logic likely cascading on patched firmware." No one had read the margin. Roman Vaer was 46 years old. He was broad in the shoulders, gray at the temples, with hands the size of work gloves even when he was not wearing any. He wore navy coveralls with his name stitched in white above the right pocket, faded from 2 years of wash cycles. He drove a 2009 Ford Ranger with a cracked tail light and a passenger seat that smelled, faintly and permanently, of crayons. He had a PhD in electrical engineering from Texas A&M. He had 11 peer-reviewed publications on directional overcurrent relay logic. He held U.S. patent number 8447902, filed in 2011, granted in 2013, on the protection scheme that Tessen Power and Light and 17 other utilities across the Eastern interconnection used to coordinate fault detection between substations. None of his co-workers knew this. None of his neighbors knew this. The man who hired him into the Lineman crew did not know this, because Roman had checked the box on the application that said high school diploma and left the rest blank. The application form did not ask about patents. Roman had not lied. He had simply not volunteered. His daughter Chloe was 5 years old. She had her mother's eyes, gray with a green edge, and her mother's habit of asking 3 questions in a row before waiting for an answer. She was small for her age. She had a gap in her front teeth where the top middle tooth had come out 2 weeks ago. She kept the tooth in a glass jar on the kitchen windowsill next to her mother's reading glasses, which Roman had not been able to throw away. On the morning of the firing, Chloe was at Mrs. Avila's house 2 doors down, eating oatmeal with brown sugar and watching the sky turn pink through the kitchen window. She was wearing the yellow rain boots she always wore, even when it was not raining, and she had on her hip the yellow hard hat keychain her father carried on his belt every day. The keychain was a tiny plastic construction helmet, the size of a grape, with a clip on the back. Her mother had ordered it from a catalog 4 years ago for Chloe's first birthday, when Hannah was still alive and still ordering catalogs. Chloe had taken it off her father's belt that morning to hold while she ate. She had promised to give it back when he picked her up. Mrs. Avila was 68 years old. She had been a kindergarten teacher in Briar Wells for 31 years before her hip went bad. She watched Chloe weekday mornings from 6 to 7:30 for $60 a week, which she returned to Roman every Christmas in an envelope marked, "For Chloe's books." She did not have grandchildren of her own. She had a porch swing, 2 cats named Bean and Sprout, and a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and burnt coffee. She had known Hannah. She had brought a casserole the week after the funeral. She had never asked Roman a single question he did not want to answer. On the morning of the firing, Mrs. Avila kissed Chloe on the top of the head and said, "Your daddy's a good man. You know that?" Chloe said, "I know." She said it the way a child states a fact, the way she might have said the sky was blue. Mrs. Avila watched through the screen door as Roman's truck pulled away. The yellow hard hat keychain swung from his belt, catching the dawn light through the truck window. The reason Roman was at substation number 4 on a Tuesday morning instead of at a research desk at A&M or at the consulting firm he had co-founded in 2014 was that 2 years and 4 months ago, his wife Hannah had a seizure in their kitchen at 3 in the morning. She had been managing her epilepsy with medication since she was 17. She had been seizure-free for 9 years. The seizure that night was not the one that killed her. The complications were. Status epilepticus, the doctors called it. Roman sat in a hospital chair for 41 hours before they told him. He drove home and made Chloe a peanut butter sandwich because she asked for one. He did not cry until after she was asleep, and then he cried in the garage so she would not hear. 2 weeks later, he resigned from the consulting firm. 4 months later, he applied to the Lineman crew at Tessen Power and Light. He wanted shift work. He wanted to be home for kindergarten pickup. He wanted, more than anything, to be the one who walked through the door at 3:30 in the afternoon. The directional overcurrent relay is a piece of equipment about the size of a shoebox, mounted in a steel cabinet that decides which way electrical current is flowing through a transmission line during a fault. A short circuit on a power grid is not a simple thing. Current can flow in from either direction. If the relay trips the wrong breaker, it can isolate a healthy line and feed the fault from another source, which trips another breaker, which feeds the fault from yet another source, and within seconds, you have what engineers call a cascade. A cascade is what happened in the Northeast in 2003. A cascade is what darkened 50 million people for 2 days. Roman's patent, US 8447902, described a way of teaching the relay to distinguish a real fault from a phantom one by sampling the harmonic signature of the current 3 times in the first half cycle. It was a small idea. It saved utilities millions of dollars a year and probably saved lives. Tessen Power and Light had licensed it in 2014. 6 months before that Tuesday morning, the firmware on every Tessen relay had been updated. The update was pushed out by an outside contractor who had been hired to reduce nuisance trips on the rural lines. The contractor's engineer had written a small patch. The patch had been tested in simulation. It had not been tested against the original directional logic Roman had written. Roman had read the firmware release notes one evening in his kitchen, with Chloe asleep on the couch under a fleece blanket. He had looked at the patch number. He had looked at the version line. He had said, out loud, to the empty kitchen, "That will cascade on a phase-to-phase if bus 4 ever pulls hard." Then he had washed the dinner dishes and gone to bed. He filed the concern through internal email the next morning. The email went to a regional supervisor, who forwarded it to engineering, who marked it low priority, route to Q3 review. Q3 had not arrived yet. At 5:41 that Tuesday, Roman was kneeling beside the disconnect under bus 4, replacing a fuse holder that had pitted from a small overvoltage event the week before. His knees hurt. His back hurt. The hard hat keychain hung from his belt, and he could feel it tap his thigh every time he leaned forward. He had pulled the new fuse holder from his lunch pail and laid the old one on a clean rag. He glanced up at the SCADA panel inside the small operator hut. The reading on bus 4 was drifting. Not much, less than 0.1%, but the harmonic signature was leaning the wrong way, the way a man leans before he falls. Roman watched it for 40 seconds. He pulled out his pocket notebook and wrote down 4 numbers. He stood up. He walked into the operator hut and said quietly to the field supervisor on duty, "Bus 4's reading drift. You'll cascade by noon." The field supervisor was a man named Drager, who had been with Tessen for 19 years. He was friendly enough. He liked country music and 3-stripe boots. He did not understand harmonic signatures. He looked at the SCADA panel and saw 4 green bars. He said, "Roman, you've been hitting the coffee too hard. We're solid." Roman said, "The patch from November isn't seeing the phase angle the way the original logic did. It'll misread a phase to phase as a single line to ground. The wrong breaker will open." Drager smiled the way men smile when they have decided someone is being eccentric. He said, "Write it up in the morning ticket." Roman said he already had. Drager said, "Then we're covered." Outside, a black Lincoln SUV came up the gravel road, followed by a silver sedan and a news van. The CEO's tour had arrived 8 minutes early. Margaux Tessen was 35 years old. She had a Stanford-MBA, a 6-figure shoe budget, and a way of entering rooms that made everyone inside straighten without thinking. She had inherited a 38% stake in Tessen Power and Light when her father, William Tessen, had a stroke during a board meeting 11 months ago and had not woken up since. She had been running the company ever since, with the title of acting CEO, while the board decided whether to make it permanent. The board would decide that summer. The tour that morning was for 2 state utility regulators, a journalist from a regional energy publication, a stringer from the Associated Press, and a photographer. Margaux had personally chosen substation number 4 because it was the cleanest substation in the network. Or, it had been, until 11 hours ago, when a maintenance worker had filed a ticket about bus 4. She did not know about the ticket. The ticket had been routed to Engineering Q3 review and then sat in a queue. What Margaux knew was that the tour was running smoothly. The journalists were taking polite notes. The regulators were nodding. She stepped onto the gravel pad in a slate gray wool coat and safety yellow flats she had bought specifically for the photograph. She turned to the photographer and said, "Get the transformer in the background." The photographer raised his camera. And then she saw him. A man in stained navy coveralls kneeling by a steel cabinet with a yellow plastic keychain swinging from his belt. He was talking quietly to Drager. He did not notice the cameras. He did not look up. He pointed at the SCADA panel and said something the journalists could not hear. Margaux's chief of staff, a tall man named Pell with a Yale law degree and a habit of leaning toward her right ear before speaking, leaned now. He whispered, "That's the lineman from the morning ticket. He's been a problem." Margaux did not turn her head. She said, "Define problem." Pell said, "Files concerns, won't accept the engineering decisions. Wrote a 4-paragraph email last month about a firmware patch." Margaux nodded once. She had been waiting for an opportunity to show the regulators that Tessen Power and Light was a tight ship. She had a story prepared about discipline, accountability, and the new generation of utility management. She had not expected the story to arrive in coveralls before 7 in the morning. But there it was, kneeling on the gravel, swinging a yellow keychain. She crossed the gravel pad in 17 strides. The cameras followed. Roman stood up as she approached. He wiped his hands on the rag. He did not extend one. Margaux said, loudly enough for the journalists to hear, "I understand you have opinions about our firmware." Roman said, "Bus 4's reading drift, ma'am. The patch from November doesn't see the phase angle right. You'll cascade by noon." She tilted her head. She smiled. It was the smile she had practiced for the magazine profile last year. She said, "Bus 4's reading drift. Did you go to engineering school, sir?" Roman did not answer. He looked at the keychain at his belt. Then he looked back at her. He said, "I'm telling you what I see." Margaux turned to the regulators. She lifted her hand at Roman the way a teacher gestures toward a chalkboard. She said, "This is what we've been working to change. Field staff who think they know more than the engineers. Field staff who file complaints instead of fuses." She turned back to Roman. She said, "Stick to changing fuses, sweetheart." The journalist from the regional publication wrote that down. The AP stringer raised his camera. The photographer caught the moment Margaux's smile widened. Roman said nothing. Draeger looked at his boots. The two regulators exchanged a glance that the cameras did not catch. Margaux said, "And while we're here, let's go ahead and make this clean. You're terminated. Pick up your final paycheck at the office." He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not pull the patent paperwork from the glove box of his truck, where it sat in a manila folder he had not opened in 9 years. He bent down. He folded the rag. He picked up the old fuse holder and put it in his lunch pail. He clipped his pocket notebook to his coverall pocket. He touched the yellow hard hat keychain at his belt once with the side of his thumb. Then he walked across the gravel pad toward the perimeter gate. His back was straight. His pace was even. He did not look at the journalists. He did not look at Draeger. He looked at the gate, and he walked through it, and he closed it behind him. Margaux watched him go. She exhaled, just slightly, through her nose. The AP stringer noticed. He filed it away. The regulators did not file it away, exactly, but they remembered it later. Draeger turned to follow Roman, then thought better of it, then stood awkwardly between his old boss and his new one. Margaux said to the cameras, "And that, gentlemen, is what accountability looks like." The regional journalist nodded politely. The regulator on the left, a woman in her 60s named Cleta Marsh, did not nod. She had spent 30 years inspecting transmission infrastructure. She had heard 1,000 field engineers say things were going to cascade. About 1 in 50 had been right. She made a small note in her phone. The note read only, "Bus 4 drift. Lineman fired. Watch." Roman drove home in the Ranger with the windows down. The road from Substation 4 to Briar Wells ran past a long field of dry grass that, in another month, would burn off in patches when the temperature climbed past 105. He kept his hands at 10 and 2. He did not turn on the radio. He thought about Hannah. Not the dyeing, but the framing. She had bought a piece of cheap walnut at a craft store the week his Fundamentals of Engineering certificate came in the mail, back when he was 23 and still smelled of dorm room coffee. She had cut the mat herself, crooked on one corner, and she had hung it over the small desk in their first apartment. She had said, "I'll be proud of you no matter where you end up, Roman, just so you know." He had laughed. He had not thought then that he would end up in a Ranger driving away from a substation in West Texas, fired in front of 2 reporters, with a yellow plastic keychain swinging from his belt. He did not go home. He drove to Mrs. Avila's. He sat in the truck for a minute before he got out. He took the keychain off his belt and put it in his front pocket where Chloe would not see it. He walked up the porch and knocked. Mrs. Avila opened the door with flour on her hands. She looked at his face. She did not ask. She said, "She's brushing her teeth. Coffee's on." He stood in her kitchen. He drank a cup of black coffee and watched the second hand on her wall clock move past 7:17, 7:18, 7:19. Mrs. Avila did not speak. She slid a plate of toast across the counter. Roman ate 1 slice. At 7:22, the lights in the kitchen flickered. Not enough for Mrs. Avila to notice, enough for Roman to feel it in his teeth. He stood up. He walked to the kitchen window. He looked east toward the transmission lines on the horizon. The lines were still. The hum was wrong. 22 minutes after Margaux Tessen had told a maintenance worker to stick to changing fuses, a phase-to-phase fault developed on Bus 4 at substation number 4. The fault was small, 200 amps of imbalance. Under the original directional logic, relay R31 would have opened a single breaker and isolated the fault inside 90 milliseconds. Under the patched firmware, relay R31 read the phase angle through the new filter and decided the fault was on the wrong side. It opened the wrong breaker. The fault did not isolate. It fed itself from the western interconnection. Within 14 seconds, relay R32 at the next substation, 16 miles east, made the same mistake. Then R33. Then R34. By 7:24, the Cascade had reached the Oklahoma border. By 7:26, it was in Arkansas. By 7:29, the eastern half of Louisiana went dark, from Shreveport to Lake Charles. In the control room at Tessen headquarters in Dallas, a senior dispatcher named Iris Tovo watched her board light up in a way she had only seen once before, on a training simulation that her instructor had said would never happen in real life. She picked up the red phone. She called Margaux Tessen, who was still at Substation 4 with the journalists. She said, "Ma'am, we have a Cascade. Tessen Network, Pioneer Interconnect, Mid-South. Estimated load shed 3.1 million customers." Margaux did not say anything for 4 seconds. Then she said, "What caused it?" Iris said, "Bus 4, Substation 4, directional logic misfire. Relay R31 opened the wrong breaker." Margaux turned. The 2 regulators were still standing on the gravel pad. Cleta Marsh was looking at her phone. Her face was very calm. The AP stringer was already typing. Pell, the chief of staff, took Margaux's elbow. He guided her into the operator hut. He closed the door. He said, very quietly, "Ma'am, we need to call the federal recovery team." Margaux said, "Call them." Pell said, "I already did. They're asking for the engineer who wrote the directional logic. The original logic, not the patch." Margaux said, "What does that mean?" Pell said, "It means they need the override key sequence to recalibrate the relays before we can re-energize. The Federal Recovery Protocol allows the original engineer to authorize. No one else." Margaux said, "Get him on the phone." Pell said, "Ma'am, that's the problem." He paused. He said, "The patent on file is US 8447902. The inventor is Roman Vaer." Margaux looked at Pell. She looked through the window of the operator hut at the gravel pad where, 26 minutes ago, she had told Roman Vaer to stick to changing fuses. She looked at the perimeter gate he had walked through. She looked at her own safety yellow flats, which were now coated in fine gray dust. She said, "Is that the same name as the man I just fired?" Pell said, "Yes, ma'am." She did not say anything. She did not move. Outside, the wind picked up. The hum of the transformers, which had been steady all morning, was no longer steady. It rose and fell in a way that even the journalists could hear now. The AP stringer had stopped typing. Everyone on the gravel pad was looking east, toward the dark horizon, where, somewhere past Shreveport, the streetlights had gone out 2 minutes ago. In the kitchen, Mrs. Avila finally noticed the lights had gone. The clock on the microwave was dark. The refrigerator was silent. Chloe came down the hall in her yellow rain boots, holding her toothbrush, and said, "Daddy, did you break it?" Roman knelt down. He put his hand on her shoulder. He said, "No, sweetheart. The grid had a hiccup." Chloe looked at him for a long moment. She reached into her pocket. She took out a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing she had made the night before at Mrs. Avila's table. It showed a man in blue coveralls standing next to a transmission tower. The man was smiling. Above his head, she had written in a 5-year-old's careful block letters the word, "Daddy." Roman took the drawing. He folded it in half. He put it in his shirt pocket next to the yellow hard hat keychain. Then his phone rang. The number was a 202 area code, Washington. He answered. A voice on the line said, "Mr. Vaer, this is Major Yael Reston, Federal Grid Recovery Team. Can you confirm you are the inventor of record on U.S. Patent 8447902? Roman said, "Yes." Reston said, Sir, we have a cascade across the Tessen network and into the Pioneer interconnect. Estimated 3.1 million customers offline. Hospitals are on backup generators. 2 are already reporting issues. We need the original override key sequence to recalibrate the directional relays. The patched firmware is locked out. You're the only person in the country with the authority to authorize the override. Roman said nothing for a moment. He looked at Chloe, who was standing in the doorway holding her toothbrush. He said, "Major, I was fired this morning, about 40 minutes ago." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Reston said, "Sir, that's a personnel matter. I'm calling on a federal grid emergency. Are you willing to authorize?" Roman said, "Yes, I am." He drove to the Tessen Regional Operations Center in Briar Wells, the small brick building on Cypress Street, with Chloe in the passenger seat. He had called Mrs. Avila and asked her to come, but she said her hip was bad and the lights were out, so Roman put Chloe in the truck and went. Chloe sat in the seat with the drawing of her father in her lap and the yellow hard hat keychain in her right hand. She did not ask where they were going. She had learned, in 2 years and 4 months, when to ask and when to wait. The Tessen Ops Center had a generator. The lights inside were on. The parking lot held 7 cars. The sheriff's deputy at the door had been told to expect a man named Vaer in a blue Ranger. He stepped aside. Roman walked in with Chloe's hand in his left and his lunch pail in his right. The control room was small. There were 4 operators at 4 desks. Iris Tovo was at the center desk with her headset on. She looked up when Roman walked in. She had never met him. She had read his name in the patent license filing 9 years ago when she was a junior dispatcher and had asked, out of curiosity, who Vaer was. Nobody had been able to tell her. Now he was standing in her control room in stained coveralls with a 5-year-old at his side. She said, "Mr. Vaer." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "We have you on a secure line with the Federal Recovery Team. The override sequence is staged. We just need you to authenticate." Roman sat down in the chair next to her. Chloe climbed into the chair beside him and put the drawing on the desk. Roman put on the headset. He spoke for 9 seconds. He gave a series of numbers in a calm, deliberate voice. Then he gave a phrase, the phrase he had written into the directional logic in 2011 as the override key. The phrase nobody but him had ever known. He said, "Hannah, the lights are on." Iris Tovo turned her head slowly. She did not ask. She knew from the way he said it that the phrase was not for her. The Federal Recovery Team confirmed authentication. The relays recalibrated across the network in 13 minutes. Substation by substation, the lights came back. Amarillo at 8:12. Tulsa at 8:19, Little Rock at 8:31, Shreveport at 8:44. By 9:15, the cascade had been reversed and the Eastern interconnect was stable. 3.1 million customers, 47 hospitals on backup that did not need to evacuate, 2 newborns in a NICU in Lake Charles who would, decades later, never know that a man in stained coveralls had said, "Hannah, the lights are on," into a headset in a small brick building in West Texas. Roman took off the headset. He looked at Chloe. Chloe was drawing on a piece of scratch paper. She looked up. She said, "Can we go home now, Daddy?" Roman said, "Yes, sweetheart." He did not go straight home. Cleta Marsh, the regulator who had taken the small note on her phone at 5:53 that morning, was standing in the parking lot of the Ops Center when he walked out. She was 61 years old, in a gray pantsuit, with reading glasses on a chain. She did not introduce herself. She said, "Mr. Vaer, I owe you a thank you that I am not authorized to make official until next week, but I'm going to make it anyway." Roman said, "Ma'am, I just did the job I was hired to do." Cleta said, "You were fired from the job you were hired to do." She paused. She looked at Chloe. She said, "Your daughter is patient." Chloe was sitting on the curb, drawing transmission towers on the back of her father's drawing. Roman said, "She is." At 10:48, a black Lincoln SUV pulled up outside Roman's apartment in Briar Wells. The apartment was on the second floor of a 2-story brick building behind the hardware store. The walls were painted off-white. There was a framed photograph of Hannah and Chloe on the bookshelf, taken at the Briar Wells County Fair the summer before Hannah died. There was a cheap walnut frame on the wall by the kitchen, holding an FE certificate from 1999. There was a small jar on the windowsill with a baby tooth in it. Chloe was at the kitchen table drawing. Roman opened the door. Margaux Tessen was standing in the hallway. She was alone. She did not have Pell with her. She did not have a photographer. Her safety yellow flats had been replaced with flat black ones. The slate gray coat was the same. She said, "Mr. Vaer, may I come in?" Roman stepped aside. She sat at the kitchen table. Chloe looked up from her drawing. Margaux said, "Hello." Chloe said, "Hi." Then Chloe went back to drawing. Margaux looked at the walnut frame on the wall. She looked at the certificate inside it. She looked at the framed photograph of Hannah on the bookshelf. She did not look at Roman for a long moment. When she did, she said, "I owe you an apology that I do not know how to make in front of your daughter." Roman said, "Then make it without performance." Margaux nodded. She said, "I was wrong this morning. I judged you on what I could see and dismissed what I could not. I fired a man who I now know is the only reason 3 million people have power tonight." She paused. She said, "I am sorry." Roman did not respond for a moment. He looked at Chloe, who was drawing a transmission tower with what appeared to be a smiley face on top. He said, "Ma'am, the patch from November needs to come out of the firmware on every relay in the eastern interconnect. The original logic needs to be restored. The contractor who wrote the patch needs to be removed from the approved vendor list, and the engineer at Tessen who signed off on the patch without testing it against the directional code needs a conversation he probably won't enjoy." Margaux said, "All of that will happen this week." Roman said, "I'd like to read the report when it's done." Margaux said, "I'll send it." Then she said, "I'd also like to offer you your job back, with the title of Chief Reliability Engineer, salary in the high 200s, direct report to me." Roman watched Chloe draw. Chloe drew a sun. She drew a stick figure under the sun. She wrote "Daddy" above the stick figure in her careful 5-year-old letters. Roman said, "I have a condition." Margaux said, "Tell me." Roman said, "Kindergarten pickup is at 3:30. I will be there. Every day. No exceptions. Not for grid emergencies, not for board meetings, not for federal calls. The job stops at 3:25. The job starts again at 7 in the morning when Mrs. Avila opens her door." Margaux nodded. She said, "Done." Roman said, "Second condition. The directional patent is mine. The original logic. The override key. When the report comes out, my name goes on it, not buried in a footnote, on the cover." Margaux said, "Done." Margaux did not stay long after that. Before she left, she looked at Chloe and said, "What's that you're drawing?" Chloe said, "Daddy's helmet." She held up the yellow hard hat keychain. Margaux looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "My father had a stroke last June. He used to take me to the substations when I was your age. He had a helmet too. His was orange." Chloe nodded the way a 5-year-old nods when she has decided an adult is being honest. Margaux stood up. She walked to the door. She turned around. She said, "Mr. Vaer, the contractor who wrote the patch, his name is Calver Mast. He's been on our approved list for 6 years. He's also my late father's nephew. He won't be on the list after Friday." Roman said, "Thank you for telling me." Margaux closed the door behind her. The next morning, Roman put Chloe in the Ranger and drove her to kindergarten. She wore her yellow rain boots. She carried the drawing of her father in her backpack. The streetlights along Cypress Street were on. The traffic light at the corner of Cypress and Magnolia worked. The flag at the elementary school was up. At 3:25 that afternoon, Roman parked the Ranger at the curb outside Briar Wells Elementary. He stood by the door of the truck. At 3:31, Chloe came out with her backpack on her shoulder and the drawing in her hand. She walked to him. She looked up at him. She said, "Daddy, are you tired?" Roman said, "A little, sweetheart. The grid had a hiccup." Chloe held up the yellow hard hat keychain. She said, "Daddy's helmet." He bent down. He kissed her forehead. They walked past the streetlights together. All of them were on.